It's not very descriptive, right? It just means after Impressionism. It doesn't tell us very much. And I think the reason for that is lack of a better term, in the sense that there are a whole series of various reactions to Impressionism. And nothing knits all of these artists together as much as just criticism of Impressionism. This idea that Impressionism was limited in its enterprise, right? By contenting itself with the merely perceptual. Some of these post-Impressionists believe that Impressionism was formless, it lacked form, and in the sense also of contenting itself with the merely perceptual. Another camp of post-Impressionists believed that Impressionism neglected the artist's emotions. So we have these two sort of significant critiques of Impressionism. And in a way, they're both right? The Impressionist enterprise was actually extremely specific. And so, it was limited in a lot of ways. And so we talked about Seurat and Cezanne last class. Seurat and Cezanne were the camp of post-Impressionists that criticized Impressionism's formlessness. And what that means is, again, lacking solid form, so figural form, objective form, and also lacking deep space. And both of these criticisms are true of Impressionism, okay? We talked about the fact that Cezanne tried to remedy that by reintroducing three-dimensional space, right? He reintroduced something along the lines of perspective, and he also sort of simplified objects. He stripped them of their particulars, okay? So we could get at something deeper, right? Sort of underlying geometry of figures. Cezanne is going to take that even further. Cezanne, again, wanting to reintroduce solid form, vigorously outlining objects, right? So as to sort of, again, somehow almost make manifest their physical presence, their physical reality. And we also talked about the fact that Cezanne is interested in vision. I didn't specify this exactly, but we talked about it. And I was reading last night, and I have sort of a good way of explaining this. The Impressionists were interested in optical reality, right? Their perceptual experience, their visual experience, and trying to replicate that in paint. Cezanne, too, is interested in vision. He's interested in our visual experience. But Cezanne, unlike, now one thing I want you to think about, we've been talking about visual experience since day one in this class, right? Renaissance artists are interested in our visual experience. But very importantly, and this is where the difference lies, the Renaissance artists and everybody else following, really until Cezanne, posits a single stationary viewer with a single vantage point. Perspective does that. Single point perspective, right, requires a single stationary viewer addressing a picture from a single vantage point, right, facing a picture from a single vantage point. And that vantage point doesn't change or the perspective skews, right? So we're talking about a single stationary viewer, single vantage point to make the perspective effective. What Cezanne is interested in, Cezanne is also interested in vision and visual experience, and the visual experience of the viewer. But he understands that visual experience exists in space and time. As I've said to you a couple of times, as I'm standing here in front of you, I'm not facing any, you guys are all sort of catty corner, you're sitting in your swivel chairs, right? Nobody is facing me directly, head on. It's not the way we exist in the world. So in some ways, that whole Renaissance scheme, right, the perspective sort of posits of a single stationary viewer, a single frontal viewer that's stationary, that's going to move, is really sort of is belied by actual experience, by actual visual experience. And what a lot of these artists now, at the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century, are interested in is truth to vision, right? Trying to figure out how to be truthful to visual experience. So the Impressionists, right, remember, interested in how things looked to them under specific light and atmospheric conditions, acknowledging that light and atmosphere change, okay? Not looking at objects in the rigid stasis of the studio. Cezanne now was interested in this idea of the fact that vision exists, our visual experience exists through space and time, okay? So we don't see a single glimpse of something and then move on. We tend to see, I might be here facing India for a moment, and then I shift my weight and I see a different perspective of India, right? As I sort of move out front of the classroom, I'm looking at Trinity, and then I'm looking at a different part of Trinity, a different perspective of Trinity. As I move, again, through space and time, my perspective shifts, and therefore my visual experience shifts. And Cezanne is trying to replicate that shifting visual experience by showing us those mutually exclusive vantage points simultaneously, right? The top of the cookies and the side of the cookies. He is trying to replicate in a single instant, because we've talked about this a lot, painting doesn't have a temporal element. In a single instant, he's trying to replicate vision through space and time. It's almost an impossible task. And that's why the stuff looks so weird. That's why the perspective is distorted, because he's showing us mutually exclusive vantage points simultaneously. The point, again, is to replicate the way, something truer to the way we actually experience the world visually, right? And so that's sort of Cezanne's genius. But a lot of these different artists, and if you sort of start to think about this, a lot of these different artists, really starting with Impressionism, are interested in visual experience. They're just interested in different aspects of visual experience. And that's part of sort of the modern sensibility, is trying to replicate how we actually experience the world, right? Not what we know, not what we think the world should look like, but the way we actually experience the world. And so if you think about that, I think it might be helpful. So I want to look at one other Cezanne. Cezanne is so important a figure and so key to Cubism, as Lexi was saying last class. We're going to talk about Cubism on Tuesday. So I want to look at one more Cezanne before we move into Van Gogh and Gauguin. Because Cezanne, again, is really one of the key artists to unlocking a lot of the sort of 20th century movements, not just Cubism, but other movements as well. So let's look at this landscape, because Cezanne really excels in two different visual genres: still life, we saw an example of, and landscape. Insofar as he is a landscape artist, his subject is not dissimilar from Impressionist subjects, except Cezanne's landscapes lack figures. They are focused on the land, and not on the sort of leisure time activities, right, pursued in the landscape. He's interested in the land itself. He's also not interested, and we've already said this, in his sort of fellow Impressionist interest in the slice of life subjects, in movement and change. He's interested in permanence, right, sort of uncovering the permanence beneath the accidents of experience, of visual experience. So let's look at this. This is a landscape called Mont Saint-Victoire. And it's a painting that Cezanne painted, or a motif that Cezanne painted over and over and over again. I can't remember when, he had grown up in the south of France. He moved to Paris in 1861, and then he retreated back to the south of France. So here, Mont Saint-Victoire is a famous mountain in the south of France, in Cezanne's native region in the south of France. His studio was not far from here, and he painted this mountain from this vantage point over and over and over again, right? Many sort of different variations of this particular motif exist, varying from more abstract to less abstract. We're going to look at this particular version of Mont Saint-Victoire. This is 1885, 1887. He continued to paint this motif all the way until the turn of the 20th century. So we have images of Mont Saint-Victoire by Cezanne from 1904, 1906 even, okay? And again, they become more and more abstract. But I want to show you this. It's early, but it's Cezanne before the turn of the 20th century. And I want to talk to you about what he's doing here, because here, again, he can be seen as being interested in sort of permanence, right? And the mountain is a great motif if you're interested in permanence and stillness, right? In sort of, the unchangingness of nature. A mountain sort of becomes the sort of paradigmatic motif. And I think that's why he was drawn to it, because it represented that permanence that he was seeking. But he's also doing something really interesting here with space. And one of the things, or spatial depth, one of the things that is going to characterize modernism, and particularly this transition from realism to modernism, which we're going to be dealing with for a number of decades, is a tension between surface and depth, a constant push and pull between surface and depth. Yes, this is rise from the Renaissance on. Now all of a sudden, beginning with Manet, right, we're talking about an embrace of the flatness of the picture plane because of the invention of photography. And so all of a sudden, artists are now going to experience, they're going to continue to represent depth to some extent, but they're also going to feel this tug of war, right? They're going to represent depth, and then they're going to represent surface. And paintings are going to sort of move back and forth between surface and depth. And I want you to think about the ways in which these paintings are doing that. We talked about Seurat already in this regard. Seurat reestablishes depth. In the Sunday afternoon, the hour of the Lac he gives us something of perspective. We talked about. He gives us planes in depth, foreground, middle ground, background. And then all of a sudden, and as Lexi was saying this, he's relying on this patterned surface that is nothing if not flat. It is an overall surface pattern of tiny juxtaposed dots that, again, recall attention to the surface. So he establishes depth and then in some ways collapses it in another moment. So there is this tension, there's a push and pull between surface and depth always. The same thing's going to happen here, but Cezanne is going to use a very different technique, and I want you to sort of try to look at this and tell me, first of all, how he establishes depth, and then second of all, how he collapses it, right, or conflates it. Because again, that is going to be one of the hallmarks of so-called modern artists, is that they're constantly sort of, again, experiencing this tension between surface and depth, wanting to represent deep space, as they've always done, as has been traditionally done, and then also being drawn back to surface, okay? And ultimately, when we talk about pure abstraction, and I should probably talk about this now, when we talk about pure abstraction, we're going to be talking about something that has no depth at all, that's completely flat, that's completely two-dimensional, right? Where there's no longer any distinction between figure and ground. That's when we get to total flatness. But until then, we're going to be talking about a push and pull, a back and forth between surface and depth. And this is, in some ways, because of that, some of the hardest stuff conceptually to understand. So if you can sort of feel how these paintings are working, you're ahead of the game. So let's look at Cezanne. First of all, abstraction as a term. We're not quite there. I should be waiting until next class. But most students, when they hear the term abstraction, think it means non-objective, meaning no recognizable figures or objects. That's actually not what abstraction means. So I'm guessing that a lot of you, if I say the term abstraction, you think of something that is just a series of colored shapes, for example, right? Sort of no recognizable figures or objects, right? That is actually what we call non-objective, the technical term for that kind of work. And we'll probably, hopefully we'll get there at the very end of this semester. That is what we call non-objective art. Abstraction, literally, to abstract, from the Greek, means to strip away, to simplify. So abstraction is simply a simplification. So any artist that we sense extreme simplification in can be technically called an abstract artist. So we could call Cezanne an abstract artist, particularly when we look at the Conservatoire on the left. This is the one from 1904, 1906. It's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. That's really famous. This is absolutely abstract, right? You can see, even from the earlier version of Conservatoire, that he is simplifying even more, right? Figures, objects, colors. He's simplifying. He's stripping away more and more details the more he paints this motif. So absolutely abstraction is a fair term here. So I just wanted you to sort of already start to be thinking about that, because you're going to be using abstraction more now. Right, so an abstraction is just an extreme simplification. And Cezanne, remember, he didn't say, I'm setting out to be an abstract painter, but he said, all nature can be reduced to the cone, the sphere, and the cylinder. That's an incredible statement of abstraction, right? That's a statement of extreme reduction or extreme simplification. And he also could have said, but he didn't, all nature can be reduced to green, blue, and ochre, because his palette consists really of those three tones. So he's got a very simplified palette. In addition to an extreme simplification of shape, right, he's got a very simplified palette as well. And that palette really is unchanging throughout his book. So let's look at the Conservatoire and talk a little bit about how it's functioning, all right? The first thing I want you to think of, and this might not come immediately to mind, but remember, Seurat and Cezanne are saying, I want to reintroduce solid form. I want to reintroduce three-dimensional depth in my landscape. I want to make of Impressionism. Remember the quote, something solid and durable, like the art of the museums. And when Cezanne says that, he means something like Poussin. Poussin, remember, is our example of classical landscape, the classical landscape tradition. Okay? He was, remember, a Baroque artist, but he was French, and we talked about the Baroque in France being more classicizing than anywhere else in Europe. He's a Baroque classicist, but he lived in the Baroque era, but he's really a classicist, right? He was French, but he spent his career in Rome. So he ingested a lot of classicism. This is the sort of paradigmatic example of a classical landscape, right? He's got the academic finish, right? No visible brushstrokes, so he's got that smooth finish. He's got deeply receding space. He's got absolutely clearly distinguished planes and depth. Right? He also gives the viewer a means to travel from foreground through the middle ground and into the background. Those are all hallmarks of the classical tradition. And another thing that we didn't talk about that's another hallmark of the classical tradition. In other words, there are conventions governing how to paint a landscape in the classical tradition, just like there were conventions governing how to paint figures. Right? Another one of the techniques was what we call a repoussoir device. And repoussoir in French means to push back, right? It's basically a framing device in landscape. And it generally consists of a big tree, right, anchoring the the lower left foreground. It gives you, it establishes your vantage point on the scene, right? It gives you sort of a point of entry into the scene and helps push you back into the scene. So it frames your vantage point and helps you enter the scene. So here we see this tree, right, that sort of hovers close to the left framing edge. And look what Cezanne has done. Cezanne has absolutely absorbed the classical tradition. He knows exactly, right, what he's doing here. He is a modern artist, but he has absorbed the classical tradition, and he's utilizing what he's learned. So here, he's given us, exactly as Poussin, a repoussoir, right, this sort of framing technique. And this tree is going to end up being very important in terms of the way we experience this landscape. So the first thing I'm trying to help you see is, like Seurat, these two, remember, this camp rejected impressionism's formlessness. They want to reintroduce solid form, and they want to reintroduce depth. And as a landscape artist, Seurat was a landscape artist. Here is Cezanne as landscape artist. They've absorbed the classical tradition. They're giving us perspective. They're giving us planes and depth. They're giving us a repoussoir device. They're giving us all these things, right, that tradition has taught them to give us. And then, once they've established that deep space, they collapse it. And that's what makes them modern. We talked about how Seurat did that. Let's talk about how Cezanne does it here. So, looking at the Montserrat, Cezanne is telling us, and note one major difference here, right? Poussin limited himself to a single figure, okay? Cezanne is going to omit figures altogether in his focus on the landscape because he is focused on permanence. He is focused on stability. And as soon as you introduce figures, right, you get impermanence and instability and movement. So he's consciously omitting figures, right, over and over again when he paints these landscapes, in order to focus again on sort of permanence and stability. And this, I'll just show you, this is an actual view of the mountain from about the same vantage point. We know that Cezanne actually owned land, and he built a small studio on it. This is not where he lived, but he owned a parcel of land, and he built a small studio on it just about where our vantage point is with Cezanne's land, right? So what do we know? Where is Cezanne standing when he's painting Mont Saint-Victoire? Okay. Well, one thing we know is that this tree is cropped by the bottom framing edge. As soon as you have a figure or object that's cropped by the bottom framing edge, that suggests that that object is close to the viewer, is proximate to the viewer, right? So we know Cezanne are standing somewhere near the base of this tree, near the trunk of this tree. And insofar as we are standing, right, at the base of that tree, on a sort of parcel of land, he was on a slight elevation, overlooking the whole valley here, and looking at Mont Saint-Victoire in the distance. So he is actually at quite a large, and in one of the readings I gave you, I think they specify how far away he is from the mountain. It's kilometers, right? I mean, it's, he's a Frenchman, kilometers, but it's miles. It's miles of distance. So he is standing, right, again, at some extensive distance from the mountain on this parcel of land where he built his studio. And that's, again, his vantage point on the mountain over and over again. And you can see there's this vast valley, right? We see suggestions of architecture spattered throughout the valley. You see a suggestion of an aqueduct. There was a prominent aqueduct that ran through the valley. He's included that, right? We see, again, tilled land, right, around the homesteads. So, we get a sense of some deep space. We also have, so we have a repoussoir device. We know where the viewer/artist is standing. We know that that is some extensive distance from the mountain. We also have established planes and depth. We have a clearly established foreground, right? Again, which is that hill on which the artist/viewer are standing. The earth that this tree is growing from. The foreground, it's where you guys are. We have the middle ground, right, this extensive valley. And then we have the background, right, the horizon, where mountain meets sky. So we have clearly distinguished planes and depth, just like a classical landscape. So Cezanne has given us all these hallmarks of the classical landscape. A couple other things. I don't know how much you remember of this because we haven't really talked about it in a long time, but we talked, especially prior to your description papers, about the visual elements of art. And I talked about color and how color functions in painting, and color cannot actually be manipulated to create the illusion of depth, right? How would that be the case? Does anybody remember what visually happens? Well, Ian, go ahead, take a stab at it.
It's like atmospheric perspective where things in the background kind of get more blue and like less contrasty, like the air particles are like kind of blurring you.
Yeah, so again, colors tend to become bluer with distance. They lose saturation, they tend to become bluer. And more generally speaking, we could say that cool tones, blue being one of the coolest of tones, cool tones tend to recede. Warm tones tend to project, and I use red as the example. Red is one of the warmer colors, and red pops, it projects, it jumps off the picture plane. You'd be hard pressed if you're looking at a painting with deeply saturated red pockets not to notice those first, because they pop. And that actually has to do with the way that our retina, the way that muscles in our eye actually are affected by different colors differently. And red tugs at the muscles in our eye. I don't know the science behind it, but red actually tugs at the muscles in our eye differently than other colors. And that's one of the reasons why it feels like it projects, it advances. So if an artist, if you know that warm colors are going to tend to advance and cool colors are going to tend to recede, if you want to paint a landscape painting, right, what kinds of colors are you going to put in the area of the picture plane that you want to read as distance? Cool tones, right? And what kinds of colors are you going to put in the area of the picture plane that you want to read as proximate? Warmer colors, right? Now, here we have the absence of red. We've already said that, right? We've only got sort of ochre, green, and blue, but look at what Cezanne's doing. He's manipulating those colors to help to establish the illusion of depth, right? So of those, he's limited himself to 3 tones, but of those tones, right, you see the most ochre, which is the yellow color, in the foreground. And you see the most blue in the background with the mountain and sky, and green in the middle ground. It's fairly simple, right? But he is manipulating warm and cool, the placement of warm and cool colors to help to create, right, that illusion of spatial depth. So having said all that, I just talked to you about all these techniques whereby Cezanne is establishing this classical landscape, right? How does the very moment he has established persuasive deep space? Because when we take a step back and look at this, we're pretty convinced that this is a pretty extensive valley, right? We're pretty convinced that that mountain is several kilometers from us. Until we see what? Does anybody notice what Cezanne has done that all of a sudden collapses the middle ground? So by that I mean, what brings the very near foreground into proximity with the very distant background? Yeah.
The use of the branch and how it's like, it's not really representative, it's more like kind of gestural, and like kind of blending with the clouds.
So where are we talking? We're talking here?
Yeah, here, there, and then over to the left, and also on top.
So one of the things I want you to look at, I mean, and Ian's right, did somebody else have a hand up? Any other comments? India?
I was going to say that the bottom left branches,
Here?
yeah, they're kind of, or like even on the other side of the tree, they're kind, like, I can't even tell if that's a branch or not.
Okay, good.
Or if that's just,
So you can't tell if it's a branch. What elements of this are part of the branch and what elements of this are part of the mountain? It's not always clear, right? What elements here are branch, what elements here are cloud? Right? Again, there is this fluidity, right, to our perceptual experience, so that's really important. What else? We know, I just said, what is the single most proximate object in this landscape to us? Abby?
the tree.
Yeah, the tree. Okay, so acknowledging that. This tree, and that also then means these branches, are in the foreground with us. Okay? What is the single most distant object in the entire landscape? The mountain, right? Can't get any deeper in space than the mountain. So, how does Cezanne place the tree and the mountain in visual proximity? Trinity.
The size of them aren't matching up. Like,
Okay.
since the tree's in the foreground, it's gonna be bigger than the mountain in the background. But
And yet, okay.
it looks not to be the same size, but like, in
Certainly.
relation with each other, it doesn't match.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, these sort of sweeping branches, right, look as if, they extend across half the width of the valley. I mean, we know that that's not actually true. So certainly he's playing with perspective. Go ahead, Sophia.
I was gonna say they frame the mountain.
Yeah, look at what's happening. So this is a branch, right? And this branch we can follow back, and we know it's connected to this tree trunk that's in our space. Okay? But look at what happens. So that branch extends, arcs over here. You guys have all sort of talked about how it sort of mimics the contours of the mountains, right? But look at what happens. So here, right, we see this branch arc around, and right here, it comes within a hair's breadth of touching the mountaintop. In this area right here, the foliage on that branch, particularly right here, comes within just what looks like a millimeter, right, of touching the top of that mountain. If you are to focus on this area alone and somehow sort of cut out the rest of the frame, it looks as if, right, that branch is sort of sweeping, is sort of grazing the mountaintop, right? So we have this moment of believing that this branch, which we know conceptually to be in the very near foreground, is coming within a hair's breadth of touching this mountain that we know conceptually to be in the very distant background. And yet, perceptually, right in this area of the picture plane, they're almost touching. They're grazing one another. That is what we call the perceptual concept. I've been talking about this, right? These artists are all playing with the distinction between perception and conception. What we see and what we know to be true. And what's happening here is Cezanne establishes this whole landscape, sets up all that deep space that we just talked about, and then when he brings that branch into such physical proximity with that mountain, all of a sudden he's collapsed the entire deep space of the valley. It's almost as if the middle ground, the whole valley, disappears. At that moment, from that specific vantage point. That deep space is collapsed. The middle ground is sort of conflated. That deep space is collapsed when foreground meets background. Right? And again, we have to step back for that middle ground to reappear and reassert itself. Look at how he's doing the same thing with the width of the valley. So we've talked about he establishes the deep space of the valley and then in an instant collapses it again. The whole middle ground conflates. Okay? Look at how he does the same thing with the width of the valley. Can anybody see how he's bringing? So we not only know that this tree and these branches, right, are in the very near foreground. We also know that they're at the furthest left of the frame, right? Again, trunk is being cut by the left framing edge as well. So how is he bringing that object, which is in at the far left of the valley? It's our framing device on the left of the plants, on the far left of the valley. How does he bring it into proximity with something on the far right of the valley? Kind of tricky to see, but you have to do some careful looking. India.
Is it because there are other branches there that aren't part of that tree, but
Yep.
they're the same size and like touching
So
those,
look,
or
exactly.
almost touching those other branches?
This branch, first we might be tempted to believe that this branch is somehow attached to this tree. But it's not, if you look carefully. We've got this branch and we can follow it as far as here, right? That's the end, right? That's the end of this branch. It's as far as it extends, sort of halfway across the valley. These branches are coming from a different tree. And where is that other tree? We don't see it. But what is our conceptual, where do we conceive of it as being? We can't see its trunk, right? Where is
To
it?
the right, to the far right.
Yeah.
That's where we can't see.
We can't see, but it's to the far right of the valley, right? Some other sort of hilltop, right? To the far right of the valley, right? Beyond the aqueduct, this sort of distant aqueduct, right? Bringing us to the right of the valley. This tree trunk is beyond that aqueduct even, right? So what's happening here is if you look carefully, you conceive of these branches as belonging to a tree that's way off our right-hand framing edge. And yet, again, so about as far away as you can get on the other side of the valley from this tree. From us, from our space. And yet, what's happening? The branches, again, right here, come within a hair's breadth of touching branches that we know belong to this tree. Right? So once again, when we look right here at this specific passage, the whole width of the valley, right to left, is collapsed in that instant. Right? Because our perceptual experience is that the branches from this tree are touching the branches from a tree at the far side of the valley. And that brings left and right together. Right? That collapses the whole width of the valley in that second. But conceptually, right, we know that that width exists. Right? So again, Cezanne is working with a tension between surface and depth, and this is actually pretty, Cezanne is very difficult, but there's one section I'm trying to remember what the title of it was. Well, I gave you a reading on the Still Life of Apples, and I gave you a reading on the Mont Saint-Victoire series, in which this is just touched on, but when you look at it, when you read it, I think it was a reading, not a video, they talk about this sort of tension between flatness and depth, so pay attention to it, right? They're establishing this sort of push and pull in Cezanne between tension and depth, right? And they only touch on it briefly, but it's there, and it's pretty compelling. So I'm trying to sort of suggest, again, in a landscape like this, we have a lot of tension going on. We have tension between surface and depth, all right? Cezanne being drawn to, right, as a critic of Impressionism's formlessness, he's drawn to form, right? He's drawn to sort of reasserting solid form and depth, which he does. He's looking at Poussin, he's looking at sort of the paradigmatic classical landscape painter. But as a modernist, he's interested in flatness, he's interested in surface. And he does that too. By, as soon as he's established that depth, collapsing it. By playing with the conceptual perceptual dichotomy. It's the same thing he was doing in the still life with apples in that stack of cookies, right? This is just a different subject, it's a different motif. He was doing the same thing there, playing with surface and depth, playing with two different vantage points. An elevated vantage point, right, and a side elevation. Okay? So this is all part of the modern experiment with visual experience. You've got to think about these artists as experimenting with visual experience. And in a way, it's all tied back to the camera, right? As soon as a camera, you have this technology now that is able to replicate exactly visual experience, right? The appearance of figures and objects, exactly replicate in a way that's never been done before. That automatically, I think, sort of demands asking a lot of questions about vision, about visual experience, especially if you're a painter. So these guys sort of, as soon as the camera's a player, these guys are really trying to sort of play with, again, sort of visual experience. What is visual experience? What is our actual visual experience? The Impressionists are interested in this idea that figures and objects exist in atmosphere, in light and atmosphere. They do not exist in the studio gloom. And that's what they're focused on, replicating the way light and atmosphere, right, appear in dissolved form. Cezanne is interested in something different. He's also interested in visual experience, but he's interested in destroying that single frontal viewer, right? He's interested in asserting, rather, this idea that we all know to be true, right? That our visual experience is through space and time, right? It's neither still, right, or frontal. It exists, right, in space and time. And that's what Cezanne is trying to show us. So all of these artists are trying to sort of understand visual experience in light of the invention of camera, and in light of sort of, bless you, new scientific discoveries in terms of the science of optics, right? And we didn't really touch on that, but there was a lot of, we're talking about, again, the backdrop for this stuff is still industrialization. And there were lots of advances in terms of the science of optics, as it was then understood, and also advances in terms of color theory. That we'll touch on in a moment. So, that's all part of the context, right, that these artists are responding to. Does anybody have any questions? Cezanne is tricky, so if you have some understanding of what I'm trying to say, here, you're ahead of the game. All right, let's do it. So, there is this other camp of post-impressionists. And stylistically, they couldn't be much different from the but they are post-impressionists, nevertheless, because they are dissatisfied with the limitations of Impressionism. But this camp, this is the Van Gogh Gauguin camp, this camp is critical of the Impressionists' neglect of the emotions. Their feeling, no pun intended, their feeling was that by focusing so obsessively on the perceptual, what they would call the merely perceptual, that is at the expense of the representation of the artist's emotions. When you focus so heavily, right, again, on sort of faithfulness to optical reality, on science, the science behind vision, right, you sort of, by definition, neglect the artist's emotions. That's not part of the approach to Impressionism. So these guys, Van Gogh and Gauguin, want to once again, represent the artist's emotions, okay? And they, the two of them, also are going to come by that goal in different ways. So this is Van Gogh. Van Gogh is an artist with whom most students are familiar, mainly because of his biography and not because of his painting. Van Gogh has a very sort of famous biography. Most of you probably know. So what do you guys know about Van Gogh? Anything about his biography? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
He was very depressed. He couldn't live on his own. He only sold one painting in his lifetime, and he lived with his brother Theo, whom he wrote like a ton of letters to. And his brother was like his biggest supporter in his life and got him like mental health treatments, which is where he did a lot of his best work.
Good. Yep. All of that is totally spot on. He didn't live with Theo, but Theo was Theo mainly lived in Paris, and Van Gogh. When Van Gogh was in Paris, he was with Theo, but Van Gogh often retreated to the countryside. But Theo was definitely his biggest supporter. Theo was actually an art dealer, so Theo was able to try to facilitate sales of his paintings and be supportive of him. He was his brother's sort of greatest supporter, but also greatest critic. We read in the letters between the two of them that if Theo didn't like something that Van Gogh was trying, he told him so. Really in an effort to establish sales of the paintings, right? As Abby said, and one of the things we know most about Van Gogh is that he was mentally ill. And we believe, Alexi, you want to add something?
Just that he ate the yellow paint, right? And then cut off his ear.
So we think that I don't know about the eating the yellow paint, but he may have had, what you're talking about is lead. There was lead in paint, or high levels of lead in paint. And he might have had some exposure to lead poisoning, which certainly could have contributed to his mental state. What we think and he did, and we'll talk about the ear, he actually ended up having a fight with Gauguin, who was his fellow painter, dear friend, and we're going to talk about Gauguin in just a moment. And as a result of that fight, Van Gogh cut off part of his own ear. So he self-harmed. Van Gogh was probably, they considered him mentally ill. They considered him, sort of insane in the 19th century. And he was ultimately committed to an insane asylum in Saint-Rémy. And that's actually, and Abby sort of alluded to this, that's actually where this painting was painted. So true, some of his best work was actually painted after he was incarcerated in an insane asylum. But we think today, in some ways, I always feel like, there are an infinite number of stories like this, but Van Gogh is just so, he's such a celebrity. We think today that he suffered from schizophrenia, and that could have been treated. In today's world, he would have had medication, and he would have been able to manage it, right? And so he was probably bipolar. He had extreme highs and extreme lows, and it's something that, if properly diagnosed, can be treated today. But, of course, he wasn't. He wasn't diagnosed. There wasn't medication for this kind of thing, and he wasn't diagnosed. He was just considered insane. So he, was committed to an insane asylum. So it's sort of it's just a horrible, sort of a horrible story for lots of reasons. This great genius, and he wasn't appropriately diagnosed, and therefore he, ultimately succumbed to his mental health illness, and he killed himself in 1890. So he died in his own hand. So it's a tragic story. Of course, there are an infinite number of such stories out there in the world, but Van Gogh as a celebrity is just one that we're well aware of. So Van Gogh, most students are sort of fascinated by his biography. And I try to sort of caution the reading of his paintings too much through the lens of his biography, through the lens of his story, and trying to focus a little bit on them, sort of visually, on their sort of, their formal elements, and on the historical context. It's very tempting to read painting through sort of someone's life story. But, as tempting as that is, I think, sometimes it's important to kind of do things. But this is a really, really important painting for a lot of reasons. Van Gogh's work is just incredibly beautiful, I think. And it's even more beautiful in person. Van Gogh's painting is sort of, most of the time this is true, but Van Gogh, particularly when you see stuff in person, it's just mind-blowingly beautiful, and for a lot of reasons, but mostly because there's a lot of buildup of paint on the surface of the canvas. It's what we call a heavy impasto, so the paint is thickly applied in a lot of areas, and it's just really visually compelling, and you can't really get that sense in reproduction. But Van Gogh actually was born in Holland. He's Dutch. And that's important to remember, I think. He moves to Paris, and he immediately, he moved to Paris in the 1860s as well, but I might be misremembering. Let me see if I can quickly find it. Here, yeah, nope, I'm way off. He moved to Paris in 1886, so it's Cézanne that moved to Paris in 1861. He moved to Paris in 1886, okay? In the middle of the Post-Impressionist period. And he fell in with the group of Impressionists and Post-Impressionists in Paris. And he started painting. He had actually hoped to be a minister. His father was a minister in Brabant, Holland, and he had trained to become a minister when he was living in Holland. And he ultimately, sort of interestingly, was not that great at, I think he failed his exams or something to enter the ministry. And so he abandoned that calling and moved to Paris to become an artist. So it's sort of an interesting life story. And immediately when he got to Paris, fell in with, again, this group of Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. He was a prolific painter, right? So he killed himself only 4 years after moving to France, and there are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of paintings. So he painted very quickly. He has the Impressionist temporality. So remember, the Post-Impressionists believe that Impressionism was limited. This group specifically believes that the Impressionists were limited through neglect of the emotions. But there are also ways in which these Post-Impressionists mirror Impressionism. So in the case of Van Gogh, it's the brushwork, right? Van Gogh, unlike Seurat or Cézanne, Van Gogh is going to adapt the Impressionist color patch that we talked about, right? And he's going to use these incredibly sort of vivid, sort of long, tumultuous strokes of paint on the surface of the canvas, regardless of the motif he's painting. He's got these incredibly sort of large, loose brush strokes on the surface of the canvas. And the brushwork is very dynamic. It's very tumultuous. We talked about Impressionist temporality, right, as being quick because the Impressionists work quickly, and that translates as a sort of a quick visual temporality. Here, the temporality is not just quick, it's turbulent, right? It's tumultuous, always. If he's painting a landscape, that landscape seems to be undulating, right? Nothing is still in Van Gogh. And that couldn't be any less like Cézanne. Cézanne, who when he's painting a landscape is looking for permanence and stability, right? Van Gogh's landscapes literally sort of feel like you can never get your bearing because if you imagine yourself in the painting, it sort of feels like, that earth is undulating. Clearly here, the sky there's a very turbulent representation of the sky. And so I want to talk about that. So ways in which this is like Impressionism, landscape, right? And also that sort of very visible use of the color patch, right? This sort of very loose, very visible brushwork that creates movement. That's really important. So here we have Van Gogh. This is called The Starry Night. It was painted in 1889, a year before Van Gogh took his own life. And it was painted we'll talk about this, perhaps ostensibly from his room or from his studio in the asylum in which he was living, in Saint-Rémy, in the south of France. Now, he had a room in the asylum that had a window that overlooked the Apennine Mountains, right? And the view wasn't that different from the view in The Starry Night. The landscape of southern France is dotted by cypress trees. We've got this dominant cypress in the lower left-hand corner. And he was looking out again at sort of groves of cypress and at the Apennine Mountains. So in some ways, the landscape, it references, at the very least, the view through his window. But he also had a studio. He was encouraged to paint in the asylum, and he had a studio in the asylum. Not in his room, but a separate studio, and that studio didn't have a window at all. So if this painting was painted in his studio inside the asylum, he could not have been looking at the night sky when he painted it. Okay? So this is where this becomes interesting. I want to talk to you about this. Again, there is a similar view through the window of his room in the asylum. We know that he was used to looking at the Apennine Mountains. We know that he would have regularly seen cypress trees as sort of the flora of southern France. But we have this landscape, right? It's divided into two registers along the horizon line. This is a very low horizon line, okay? Here, again, on the mountain range, we just saw in Cezanne a high horizon line, right, with a mountain in the background. But we have a very low horizon line where Earth meets sky, and we have a clear demarcation of celestial and terrestrial realms, right, of sky and Earth. They're clearly demarcated. Sky, the celestial realm here, taking up probably 2/3 or more of the picture plane. And here I want you, and I don't think I have it in my PowerPoint, but I want you to remember, I don't know, add that back in. I want you to try to remember the example of Dutch landscape painting that I showed you. Huisdael, I don't know if you remember, view of Haarlem from the dunes at Overveen, and we saw those Dutch men and women pulling out reams of linen to dry on the lawn in the sun. The point I'm trying to make is I should bring that back in because it's a really compelling comparison, and this is also a point that's made in your reading on the Starry Night. This is really reminiscent of Dutch landscape painting in the 17th century, which makes sense because Van Gogh was Dutch, and that's the tradition in which he would have been sort of immersed as a child in Holland. And by that I mean a landscape tradition where the sky takes up more than half of the picture plane. Right? In that view of Haarlem from the dunes of Overveen by Van Huisdael, the sky is really ostensibly the true subject of the painting, and that's the case here. And the painting is called Starry Night. Van Gogh is absolutely painting a picture of the sky here. And while Huisdael purportedly was painting, the workers and sort of, their industriousness by sort of drying reams of linen in the sun, they're dwarfed by the sky in that painting as well. So it's hard to sort of avoid the sky in the Dutch landscape tradition. Okay, so certainly this is reminiscent in that regard of the Dutch landscape tradition, just the way that Cezanne was looking back at the French landscape tradition. So in addition to that, we have this village, and one thing that Van Gogh would not have seen through the window in his room at Saint-Rémy was a village, because there wasn't one there. So he might have seen the mountain range, the Apennines. He would have seen cypress trees. He certainly could have seen the night sky, but he would not have seen these buildings in this village that